Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. Ever wonder why some cabins stay abandoned even when they look perfectly fine? Today's November special answers that question with 7 chilling true stories from Appalachia. Normal people doing normal jobs stumbled into nightmares they'll never forget. Don't forget to subscribe, drop a like, and tell me where you're from in the comments. Thanks for the support. Now, story time. I was 17 when this happened, back in my senior year at Harlan County High. I'm 28 now, working IT for a bank in Lexington, and I still think about that day every time I see a camera flash. This was November 2014, and our AP art class was taking a photography field trip to document historical rural architecture, which was just a fancy way of saying we were going to take pictures of old, falling down buildings scattered around eastern Kentucky. Mrs. Patterson, our art teacher, had been planning this trip for months, talking about how we needed to capture the authentic character of Appalachian heritage before more of these old places disappeared completely. I remember being excited about it because I'd been getting pretty serious with my photography that year, saving up for a decent DSLR and everything. 6 of us signed up for the trip. Me, Sarah Mullins, Jake Carter, twin sisters Emma and Ellie Dawson, and this quiet kid named Marcus who always sat in the back of class. The plan was simple enough. We'd take the school bus out to 3 different locations around Devil's Creek Hollow, spend about an hour at each site taking photos, then head back to school to develop them in the darkroom. Mrs. Patterson had picked out an old mill, an abandoned church, and this burned-out cabin she'd found on some historical survey map. The cabin was supposed to be our last stop, the most atmospheric, according to her notes. Looking back now, I wish we'd never made it that far. Everything went fine at the first 2 locations. The old mill was actually pretty cool to photograph. All these weathered wooden beams and rusted metal wheels, with morning light filtering through the broken roof in these perfect diagonal shafts. Sarah was getting some really artistic shots of the water wheel, and Jake was documenting all the old machinery with his dad's vintage Nikon. The twins were working together on composition studies, and Marcus was doing his usual thing of wandering off to find weird detail shots that nobody else noticed. Mrs. Patterson was happy with our work, taking notes about aperture settings and discussing how different lighting conditions affected our exposures. The abandoned church was smaller and darker, but we managed to get some good interior shots of the broken pews and the way sunlight came through the cracked stained glass windows. Marcus found this old Bible that had been left behind, its pages yellow and brittle, and he got some close-up shots of the deteriorating text that were actually pretty haunting. We were feeling confident about our portfolio by the time we loaded back onto the bus around 1:30 p.m. to head to our final destination. That's when our day started going wrong. About 20 minutes into the drive toward Devil's Creek Hollow, the bus just died. I mean completely dead. No sputtering, no grinding, just a sudden loss of power like someone had flipped a switch. Mr. Hensley, our bus driver, pulled over onto the shoulder and tried to restart it several times, but nothing happened. The engine wouldn't even turn over. Mrs. Patterson called the school on her cell phone to request a replacement bus, but they told her it would be at least 2 hours before they could get another driver out to our location. We were stranded on a narrow mountain road with nothing around except dense forest on both sides. But Mrs. Patterson, being the dedicated teacher she was, decided this was actually a perfect opportunity. She'd spotted the burned cabin through the trees, maybe a quarter mile off the road, and suggested we hike over to get our final photo session done while we waited for our ride. "Think of it as found time," she said, gathering up her lesson plan folder. "We can turn this mechanical failure into an educational advantage." The hike through the woods to reach the cabin was actually pleasant at first. It was a cool November day, probably around 50 degrees, with that crisp autumn air that makes everything feel clean and sharp. The trees were mostly bare by then, but there were still some yellow and brown leaves scattered on the ground, and you could hear them crunching under our feet as we walked. Mrs. Patterson had brought a thermos of hot chocolate that we passed around, and everyone was in a good mood despite the bus breaking down. When we first saw the cabin through the trees, it looked exactly like what you'd expect from an old, burned-out homestead. The roof had completely collapsed inward, leaving just the stone foundation and parts of 3 walls still standing. What used to be the front door was now just a dark opening framed by blackened timber. There was a small historical marker posted near what must have been the front yard, the kind of brown metal sign you see at state parks and historical sites. I remember Sarah reading the marker out loud while we unpacked our camera equipment. It said the cabin had belonged to the Hendricks family, who'd lived there from 1943 until a house fire in November 1962 killed all 5 family members. According to the marker, the fire had started in the back bedroom around 3:47 p.m. on November 15th, and the family had died trying to escape when the front door became jammed. The father, mother, and 3 children, ages 2, 6, and 9, had all been found near the door, apparently having been overcome by smoke while trying to force it open. Tragic, Mrs. Patterson said. But then she immediately switched into teacher mode. But also historically significant. This represents the kind of rural poverty and unsafe living conditions that were common in Appalachian communities during the mid-20th century. The artistic challenge here is to capture both the human story and the architectural decay. We spent the next hour taking photos and actually having a good time with it. The cabin ruins were genuinely photogenic, all these interesting angles where the collapsed roof beams created dramatic shadows and the cabin ruins. The contrast between the weathered stone foundation and the charred wood was striking in our viewfinders. Jake was getting some great wide shots that showed the cabin in its forest setting, while the twins focused on detail work, like the way moss and small plants had started growing in the cracks between the foundation stones. I was working on a series of photos that documented how nature was slowly reclaiming the structure. There were vines growing up through the empty window frames, and in one corner of what used to be the main room, a small tree had actually sprouted and grown to about 6 feet tall. Marcus had climbed carefully through a gap in the collapsed wall to get interior shots, and Sarah was experimenting with different angles of the empty door frame. That's when things started feeling wrong. It was around 3 p.m., and we'd been there for almost an hour, when I first noticed the smell. It was faint at first, just a hint of something that reminded me of a campfire, but it gradually got stronger. I figured maybe someone was burning brush somewhere nearby, or there was a chimney fire in one of the houses scattered around these mountains. But when I mentioned it to Jake, he said he'd been smelling it too, and it seemed to be getting more intense. Then our camera started acting up. At first it was just little things, my LCD screen flickering occasionally, or the autofocus taking longer than usual to lock on. But within about 15 minutes, all 6 of us were having problems. Sarah's camera kept overexposing every shot, showing these weird bright flashes in her images even though we were shooting in normal daylight. The twins' cameras started displaying error messages they'd never seen before, and Marcus's camera began taking pictures by itself, the shutter clicking rapidly without him pressing the button. But the really weird thing was the temperature. Even though it had been a cool autumn day, the air around the cabin was getting uncomfortably warm. Not just warm, hot. Like walking too close to a bonfire. I remember pulling off my jacket and still feeling sweat starting to form on my forehead, even though we were standing in the shade of the trees. Mrs. Patterson was getting concerned about our equipment malfunctioning, and she suggested we should probably start heading back toward the road to wait for the replacement bus. But as we started packing up our gear, that's when we heard it. 3:47 p.m. exactly, according to Marcus's digital watch. A woman's voice, clear as day, screaming from somewhere inside the cabin ruins. "Get the children out! Please, somebody help us get the children out!" We all froze. The voice was coming from the interior of the burned cabin, but there was nobody there. We could see straight through the collapsed walls into what used to be the main room, and it was completely empty except for debris and that small tree growing in the corner. "Did everybody hear that?" "Mrs. Patterson asked her, voice shaky. We all nodded. There was no mistaking what we'd heard. Then our cameras started going crazy. All of them simultaneously. The shutters were clicking rapidly like machine guns, taking picture after picture without any of us touching the controls. The LCD screens were showing images that didn't match what we were seeing with our own eyes. Instead of showing photos of the empty ruins, our cameras were displaying pictures of people, a family running through flames. I looked down at my camera's screen and felt my stomach drop. The image was crystal clear. A woman in a 1960 style dress, carrying a baby, running through a room filled with fire and smoke. Behind her was a man pulling two small children by their hands, and all of them were screaming. But here's the thing that made my skin crawl. They were all on fire. Their clothes, their hair, their skin, burning, but still moving, still conscious, still screaming. "Are you guys seeing this?" Sarah whispered, holding up her camera. Her LCD screen showed the same family, but from a different angle, like she'd been standing in a different part of the room when the photo was taken. That's when we saw them with our own eyes, not through the camera screens, but standing right there in the cabin ruins. The burning family from the photos, running the same route over and over again. From the back of the cabin toward the front door, the woman carrying the baby, the man dragging the two older kids, all of them on fire but moving like the flames weren't even there. They were trapped in some kind of loop, reliving their death over and over again. We watched them run from the back bedroom to the front door, heard the man frantically rattling the door handle and cursing as he tried to force it open. Then they'd all collapse near the door, dying from the smoke and flames, only to immediately reappear in the back bedroom and start the whole sequence again. But here's the part that still gives me nightmares. They could see us too. After we'd been watching for maybe 30 seconds, the woman looked directly at me. Her face was burned and her hair was on fire, but her eyes were completely aware. She was looking at me like she was seeing me for the first time, and there was this desperate hope in her expression. She started reaching toward us, still carrying the burning baby in her arms. "Please," she said, and her voice was clear despite the smoke and flames surrounding her. "Take them, take my children, let them live." That's when Sarah made the mistake. The woman was holding the baby out toward us, begging us to take it, and Sarah, who had younger siblings of her own and probably acted on pure instinct, reached out toward the burning child. The moment Sarah's fingers touched the ghost baby, she caught fire too. Real fire, spreading up her arms like she'd been doused in gasoline. She started screaming, and the smell of burning hair filled the air around us. But here's the truly horrifying part. The flames weren't actually burning her. I could see them engulfing her arms and starting to spread to her shoulders, but her clothes weren't charring, and her skin wasn't blistering. It was like she was experiencing the sensation of being on fire without the physical damage, and somehow that made it even worse. The woman smiled when Sarah caught fire, and I realized what was happening. The ghost family wasn't just trapped in their death loop. They were trying to escape it by replacing themselves with us. They wanted to pass their burning death to new victims so they could finally be free. I grabbed Sarah by the waist and yanked her away from the ghost woman, breaking the physical connection between her and the baby. The flames on Sarah's arms immediately went out, but I could see burn patterns on her skin where the ghost child had touched her. That's when all hell broke loose. The other family members started reaching for us too, trying to grab us and transfer their burning death. The two children ran toward the twins, their small hands leaving trails of fire in the air as they reached out. The father lunged toward Marcus, his entire body engulfed in flames, but moving with inhuman strength and speed. We ran, all 6 of us, sprinting through the woods toward Mrs. Patterson's voice. She was standing by the road screaming our names, apparently unable to see the burning family chasing us, but sensing that something terrible was happening. I could hear the ghost children laughing behind us, and when I looked over my shoulder, I saw the woman still carrying her baby, keeping pace with us easily, despite being completely on fire. They chased us all the way to the edge of the woods, grabbing at our clothes and hair with their burning hands. Jake stumbled and almost fell when the father caught his backpack, but he managed to slip out of the straps and keep running. Emma was crying, and Marcus looked like he was about to throw up, but we all kept moving. The moment we crossed from the woods onto the road where Mrs. Patterson was waiting, the ghost family stopped. They stood at the tree line, still burning, still reaching toward us, but unable to follow us any further. I guess they were bound to the cabin and the surrounding area where they'd died. The replacement bus arrived about 20 minutes later, and we rode back to school in complete silence. Mrs. Patterson kept asking us what had happened, why we all looked so shaken up, but none of us could figure out how to explain it without sounding insane. When we got back to school and developed our photos in the darkroom, they told the whole story. Clear, undeniable images of the burning family chasing us through the woods. Pictures of Sarah on fire, reaching toward the ghost baby. shots of the twins running while two burning children pursued them. But the most disturbing photos were the ones our cameras had taken automatically, showing us from the ghost family's perspective. In those images, we were the ones on fire. The photos showed us burning, just like the Hendricks family, trapped in the same death loop, experiencing their fate. Sarah still has scars on her arms where the ghost baby touched her. Perfectly symmetrical burn patterns that medical doctors can't explain, since there's no evidence she was ever actually exposed to real fire. She won't talk about what it felt like to be burning without being burned, but sometimes I catch her staring at the scars with this haunted expression. Mrs. Patterson reported the incident to the school administration as unexplained equipment malfunctions and student injuries during a field trip, and they banned photography field trips to historical sites permanently. The cameras that malfunctioned that day were all permanently damaged, something about the internal circuitry being inexplicably overheated, according to the repair shop. None of us 6 ever took another photography class. We tried to stay friends after high school, but it was difficult when we all shared this experience that we couldn't really talk about with anyone else. We still meet up every November 15th, though, just to check on each other and make sure we're all still alive and human. It sounds paranoid, but after what we saw that day, none of us are entirely confident that we didn't leave part of ourselves in that burned cabin. I still take pictures sometimes, but I always check the LCD screen immediately after every shot, and I've never been back to Devil's Creek Hollow, not even to drive through it. Some places are better left alone. I'm 47 now, and I work a quiet desk job processing paperwork for a small accounting firm in Charleston. It's boring work, but it's safe, and that matters to me more than most people would understand. See, I used to be an insurance adjuster, spent 15 years investigating fraud cases, traveling all over West Virginia to document suspicious claims. I was good at it too, had a real knack for spotting when people were trying to pull one over on the company. That was before Poison Creek Hollow. Before I learned that sometimes the truth is so much worse than any lie someone could tell. This all happened back in November of 2019, when I was still working for Allegheny Mutual. I'd just gotten assigned what looked like a straightforward environmental fraud case, some property owner claiming massive chemical contamination damage on an old cabin he'd inherited. The guy was asking for close to $2 million in cleanup costs, which immediately raised red flags. These environmental claims were becoming more common, and half of them turned out to be people trying to blame natural decay on corporate pollution. Easy money if you could make it stick. The property was way up in Poison Creek Hollow, about 40 miles southeast of Charleston. I'd driven past the area before, but never had reason to go up into those hills. The owner had sent photos showing dead soil around his cabin, claiming some chemical company had been illegally dumping there in the 80s. My job was simple: document the scene, take soil samples, and prove this was just normal mountain weather damage. I'd done dozens of cases like this. I remember driving up there on a Thursday morning, coffee in my thermos, camera gear in the back seat. The road got rough about 10 miles in, turning from asphalt to gravel to barely more than tire ruts. My GPS started getting spotty around mile marker 7, but I had printed directions. The trees were mostly bare that time of year, and you could see pretty far into the woods on both sides. Normal stuff: old logging roads, a few abandoned hunting camps, the usual Appalachian landscape I'd grown up around. The first thing that struck me as odd was how quiet it got as I drove deeper into the hollow. Usually these mountain roads have plenty of wildlife: birds, squirrels, deer. But the closer I got to the coordinates I'd been given, the more everything seemed to go silent. Even my truck engine seemed muffled, like the air was thicker somehow. I just figured it was the elevation change, or maybe weather pressure dropping. When I finally found the cabin, I understood why the owner was claiming environmental damage. The building sat in what looked like a perfect circle of dead earth, maybe 50 feet in radius. No grass, no weeds, no moss, just bare dirt that looked almost gray in the overcast light. The cabin itself was old but structurally sound, probably built in the 40s or 50s. But everything around it was wrong. I parked about 20 feet back from the dead zone and started unloading my equipment. That's when I caught the first whiff of whatever was in the air there. It wasn't the sharp, acidic smell you'd expect from industrial chemicals. This was sweet, almost floral, with an undertone that reminded me of the ether they'd given me when I had my wisdom teeth out. Not unpleasant, exactly, but definitely not natural. I spent the first hour documenting the perimeter, taking photos of the clear boundary between normal soil and the dead area. That's when I started finding the equipment. Rusted barrels, lengths of PVC pipe, what looked like the remains of a portable generator. Someone had definitely been dumping something here, and recently enough that the metal wasn't completely corroded. Maybe this wasn't fraud after all. The chemical smell got stronger as I worked my way toward the cabin. By the time I reached the front porch, I was having trouble keeping my thoughts organized. Not dizzy exactly, more like peaceful. Like that feeling you get from a really good glass of wine, where all your everyday stress just melts away. I remember thinking how nice it would be to just sit down for a minute and enjoy the quiet. That should have been my first warning sign. I'd been investigating environmental cases for years, and chemical exposure was supposed to make you sick. Headaches, nausea, breathing problems. This felt like the opposite. Every breath I took made me feel better, calmer, more content than I'd been in months. I called my supervisor around 3 that afternoon to check in. Told him the environmental damage looked legitimate, and I'd need extra time to document everything properly. He wasn't happy about the overtime, but I convinced him this was the real deal. Truth was, I just didn't want to leave. The longer I stayed in that area, the more perfect everything seemed. By evening, I was experiencing what I can only describe as intense euphoria. Every worry I'd carried for years, money problems, my marriage falling apart, my dad's health issues, all of it felt distant and unimportant. The chemical compound in the air was like the world's most effective antidepressant, making me happier than I'd ever been in my life. I should have left then, should have driven back to Charleston and called in a hazmat team. Instead, I decided to spend the night in my truck, told myself I was being thorough. Really, I just couldn't bear the thought of leaving that perfect chemical piece behind. That's when I found the notebooks. They were inside the cabin, scattered on a table like someone had been interrupted while writing. Personal journals, all of them, written by other investigators who'd come to document this same site over the years. Different companies, different cases, but all of them had ended up staying longer than planned. All of them described the same artificial happiness, the same reluctance to leave. The most recent journal belonged to a DEP inspector named Marcus Chen, dated just 8 months before my visit. His early entries were professional, documenting illegal dumping and chemical contamination. But as the days went on, his handwriting got looser, more euphoric. He wrote about how peaceful he felt, how all his life problems seemed meaningless compared to staying in this wonderful place. His final entry was just one line. I understand now why nobody reports this. Paradise shouldn't be illegal. That's when I started looking around the cabin more carefully, and that's when I found them. 3 bodies, mummified by the dry air and whatever chemicals were in the atmosphere. They were sitting in chairs around the main room, all of them smiling. Their skin was leathery and preserved, but their faces showed no signs of distress. They looked peaceful, happy, like they'd died having the most wonderful dream. The visceral horror hit me then. Even through the chemical euphoria, these people had died here, dissolved from the inside out while feeling too good to care. I was bleeding internally, had been for hours, but the chemicals made it feel pleasant, like floating in warm water. My organs were liquefying while my brain told me everything was perfect. I found corporate documents mixed in with the personal journals. Internal emails from Apex Chemical Solutions detailing their illegal disposal operation. They hadn't just been dumping here, they'd been studying it, documenting how long it took trespassers to die, measuring the effects of their accidental mood-altering compound. They called it Project Paradise in their reports. The chemical mixture was a byproduct from pharmaceutical manufacturing, something that was supposed to be neutralized before disposal. Instead, they'd discovered its psychoactive properties and decided to test it. They weren't covering up environmental damage. They were perfecting a weapon that killed through artificial happiness. My phone showed 17 missed calls from my wife, but her voice on the voicemail sounded distant and irrelevant. The chemicals had erased my ability to care about anything except staying in that toxic paradise, even as my body was literally dissolving. I found my blood in the sink where I'd been coughing, but it tasted sweet, like cherry syrup. My lungs were filling with chemical fluid that my brain interpreted as the most delicious thing I'd ever tasted. I was dying and grateful for it, just like the smiling corpses around me. The only thing that saved me was thinking about my kids. Emma was 8, Billy was 6, and somewhere through the chemical haze, I remembered that they needed their father alive, not happy. I forced myself to focus on their faces, using every ounce of parental love to fight through the euphoria. Getting to my truck was the hardest thing I've ever done. Every step away from the cabin felt like losing something precious, like walking out of heaven, back into hell. I was leaving a trail of blood but feeling no pain, only this overwhelming sadness at abandoning paradise. The drive to Charleston General was a nightmare. The farther I got from Poison Creek Hollow, the more the chemical euphoria faded, replaced by excruciating pain as my dissolved organs began failing normally. I pulled over twice to vomit blood, but I kept driving. I spent 3 months in intensive care while doctors tried to understand my condition. Massive internal bleeding, organ damage they couldn't explain, chemical poisoning from compounds they couldn't identify. The insurance company quietly settled the original claim for $2.8 million and sealed all records related to the site. Apex Chemical Solutions disappeared into a maze of shell companies and legal protections. I survived, but with permanent liver damage and chronic pain that reminds me every day how close I came to dying with a smile. Sometimes, I still dream about that perfect chemical, happiness, and I wake up disappointed to be clean and miserable. The worst part is knowing that paradise exists somewhere, but it's literally toxic and designed to kill anyone who finds it. I quit insurance investigation the day I got out of the hospital. Now I process tax returns and avoid any work that might take me near industrial sites. My wife says I'm paranoid about chemical smells, but she doesn't understand how good it felt to die. How tempting it still is, even knowing the truth. The cabin's still there, with new warning signs posted by the state. But I heard through old contacts that another adjuster went missing there 6 months ago. They're still using it, still perfecting their happiness weapon for God knows what purpose. Sometimes, when life gets particularly hard, I catch myself wondering if my kids would be happier dying in chemical bliss than living in this painful, ordinary world. That's when I know the chemicals are still in my system somehow, still, whispering their poison promises. That's when I remember why I'll never go back to those hills again. I was 34 and working as a Child Protective Services investigator when I got the call that still keeps me up some nights. This was back in November 2019, and I'd been doing this job for about 8 years by then. I thought I'd seen everything: neglect cases, abuse situations, kids living in conditions that would break your heart. But looking back now, I realize I hadn't seen anything at all. The call came in on a Tuesday afternoon. Anonymous tip about 3 children living alone in a cabin up in Bitterroot Gap, Kentucky. The caller claimed these kids had been abandoned. No adult supervision, no proper care. Standard neglect report, really. I'd driven up to plenty of remote cabins before, usually found some grandparent or relative who'd been looking after things but wasn't on any official paperwork. Rural families handle things differently sometimes, and that's not always a bad thing. I grabbed my standard kit, digital recorder, camera, case files, the usual state paperwork. The drive up to Bitterroot Gap took about an hour and a half from my office in Lexington. It's one of those hollows that feels like it's been forgotten by time, where the nearest neighbor might be 5 miles away and cell service cuts out completely once you get past the main road. The kind of place where families have lived for generations on the same patch of land, and outsiders aren't exactly welcomed with open arms. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road that had seen better days. My state-issued sedan bounced and scraped over ruts and rocks, and I remember thinking I should have requested a truck for this trip. When I finally pulled up to the place, I sat in my car for a minute, just looking at it. County records showed this property had been abandoned since 1995, when the family who lived there just disappeared one day. But the cabin looked lived in. Recent lived in. There were toys scattered in the yard, a rusted tricycle, some blocks, a doll with matted hair sitting against the porch steps. Clothes hung on a line stretched between 2 trees. Small clothes that would fit children between maybe 6 and 10 years old. The windows were clean, and I could see curtains hanging inside. Somebody was definitely living here. I got out of the car and grabbed my recorder, hit record, and started my standard approach notes. November 15th, 2019, approximately 3:30 p.m., investigating report of child neglect at. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. The clothes on the line looked wrong somehow. They were the right size for kids, but the fabric felt weird when I touched it. Rough in some places, too smooth in others, like it had been sewn from materials that weren't quite cotton or polyester or anything I could identify. The toys were handmade, which wasn't unusual for a rural family trying to save money. But these toys looked like they'd been carved or constructed from materials I couldn't place either. The blocks weren't wood or plastic, they had this strange weight to them, and they felt warm to the touch, even though it was a cold November day. I knocked on the door and called out my standard introduction. Child Protective Services. I need to speak with the adult residents about a welfare check. No answer, but I could hear voices inside. Children's voices, singing something. It sounded like a nursery rhyme, but with words I didn't recognize. Not another language exactly, just wrong words. I tried the door and found it unlocked, which should have been my first real warning sign. In my experience, families who have something to hide don't usually leave their doors open for state investigators. I called out again as I stepped inside. Hello, this is CPS. I'm here about a welfare report. The inside of the cabin was set up like a normal family home, except everything was arranged at child height. The furniture, the kitchen utensils hung on hooks. Even the light switches had been moved down. But it was the drawings that really got my attention. They were taped all over the walls, typical kid artwork, except the stick figures had too many arms and legs. The houses they'd drawn had impossible architecture, rooms that couldn't exist, stairs that went in circles. And the people in the drawings all had the same thing. Smiling faces with mouths full of what looked like sharp teeth. The children's voices were coming from downstairs. There was a basement, which was unusual for cabins in this area because of the rocky ground. I could hear 3 distinct voices now, definitely children, and they were still singing. But as I got closer to the basement door, I realized the song had changed. Now they were singing "Mary Had a Little Lamb," except instead of "Everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go." They were singing "Everywhere that Sarah went, the lamb was sure to go." Sarah is my name. I'd never told anyone I was coming to this cabin except my supervisor, and I certainly hadn't mentioned my first name over the phone to anyone who might have passed it along. But somehow, these kids knew who I was before I'd even introduced myself. I went downstairs, my hand on my phone, even though I knew I had no signal out here. The basement was larger than the cabin above it, which should have been impossible. 3 children were sitting on the floor, playing with toys that seemed to be moving by themselves. Not battery-powered toys, the kind of carved wooden animals that should have stayed perfectly still, but were walking around in small circles. The children looked normal at first glance. 2 girls and a boy, ages maybe 6 to 10, healthy and clean and well-dressed in those strange fabric clothes I'd seen outside. They looked up at me when I reached the bottom of the stairs, and all 3 of them smiled. That's when I saw their teeth. Pointed, every single one of them, like needles. And their eyes, they reflected light like an animal's eyes do at night, even though we were in a dim basement. "You must be Sarah," said the oldest one, a girl with dark hair. "We've been expecting you." I tried to keep my voice steady. This was still a welfare check, I told myself. Maybe they were just kids with some kind of medical condition. Maybe the lighting was playing tricks on me. "I'm here because someone called about you, children living alone. Where are your parents?" "Our real parents only visit during certain moon phases," the boy answered, and the way he said, "real parents," made my skin crawl. "But we take care of ourselves just fine. Want to see our drawings?" Before I could answer, the youngest girl laughed. It was a normal kid's laugh, except it went on too long. "We don't need to go to school," she said. "We learn everything we need by tasting thoughts of visitors." I pulled out my digital recorder, which had been running this whole time. When I played back the last few seconds to check the audio quality, the children's voices sounded like adult voices speaking in reverse. But when I looked up at them, they were still sitting there, looking like normal kids, except for the teeth and eyes. "I think I need to speak with an adult," I said. "Is there someone I can call?" "You can call whoever you want," the oldest girl said. "But why don't you have lunch with us first? we made sandwiches. They had set up a small table with what looked like perfectly normal peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. They looked fine, but they smelled wrong. Like raw meat mixed with flowers. My stomach was already churning, but I figured I needed to maintain rapport with the children until I could figure out what was going on. I took a bite of the sandwich. It tasted normal, but immediately I felt dizzy and confused, like I was forgetting why I'd come here in the first place. The children were watching me eat with those sharp-toothed smiles, and I was starting to forget that the teeth were unusual. Everything started feeling normal and appropriate. "Let's play a game," the boy said. "We'll guess what you're going to say before you say it." I was going to say that I need to fill out some paperwork. I started to say, but they were already giggling. She was going to say she needs to fill out some paperwork. The youngest girl said, a full second before I spoke. Then they all laughed when I tried to change my words to something else, because they'd already started repeating my new sentence before I'd even thought of it. The youngest girl pulled out a piece of paper and started drawing my face while staring right at me. But in her drawing, I had the same pointed teeth and animal eyes as them. When I looked at the picture, for just a moment, I couldn't remember what my own teeth were supposed to look like. That's when I realized these weren't neglected human children. They were something else entirely, wearing human appearance like a costume, studying how Child Protective Services worked. And they'd been doing this for a long time. "You know about the Morrison case," the oldest girl said, mentioning a family I'd investigated 3 months ago. "And the Patterson children. And that little boy in Hazard County who you couldn't save." She knew details about my cases that weren't in any public record. Confidential information that only I and my supervisor should have known. They started reciting details from my reports, word for word, including notes I'd written but never filed. I looked down at my paperwork, and the words were changing while I watched. My handwritten notes about concerning conditions were rewriting themselves to say the children were healthy and well cared for. My pen was moving in my hand, but I wasn't controlling it. "We need periodic visits from authority figures," the boy explained patiently, "to practice being human and learn about social services. We've been calling in reports about ourselves for years, using different voices to bring investigators we can study." The oldest girl gestured to a filing cabinet in the corner. "Each social worker who visits stays longer than planned and eventually writes reports recommending our case be closed. Would you like to see?" The cabinet was full of files from previous investigations dating back to the 1970 seconds. All concluded that the children were fine. But as I read through them, I could see something disturbing. Each investigator's handwriting gradually changed throughout their reports, becoming more childlike, incorporating the same strange symbols from the children's drawings. My own notes were becoming harder to read. My handwriting was shifting, and I was having trouble remembering why I'd thought anything was wrong here in the first place. The children gathered around me as my thinking got cloudier, gently correcting my paperwork and helping me write what they called the proper conclusions. They were incredibly patient teachers, showing me how to fill out forms that would close their case permanently. Part of my mind knew this was wrong, but their influence made everything seem logical and appropriate. Of course, children this healthy and happy didn't need intervention. Of course, they were thriving in their independent living situation. My final report stated exactly that. I signed it with handwriting that was definitely mine, but somehow different. When I drove away, I felt satisfied with a case well handled, though I couldn't quite remember why the investigation had seemed concerning initially. It was only weeks later when I found my original notes, written in my handwriting, but saying completely different things than I remembered writing, that I realized what had happened. The children had rewritten my perceptions in real time, changing my memories and conclusions while I experienced it. I tried to reopen the case, but my supervisor said my final report was exemplary and the matter was permanently closed. When I pushed the present issue, she showed me that every investigator who'd visited that cabin had filed identical reports, using the same phrases and reaching the same conclusions. The children are still there, still learning about human authority systems by studying the social workers they summon. I never take rural cases anymore, especially ones involving isolated cabins and reports of unsupervised children. Sometimes I dream about those pointed teeth, and I wonder how many other closed cases involve children who aren't quite human. But mostly, I try not to think about it. Because deep down, I'm still not entirely sure my thoughts are completely my own anymore. I still work in child protection, but I stick to urban cases now. Places where there are witnesses, where backup is always close by, where the children are definitely, unmistakably human. To this day, I've never told anyone what really happened up there. Who would believe it? But every time I sign my name, I check my handwriting, carefully, just to make sure it still looks like mine. I'm 34 and work as a home health aide in Eastern Tennessee. Been doing it for about 8 years now. Last November, I got a call from my supervisor about checking on Mrs. Evelyn Henderson, TCA. She'd missed 3 appointments and wasn't answering her phone, but her neighbors swore they'd seen lights in her cabin windows at night. The thing about Mrs. Henderson was, she lived way out in Thorn Creek Hollow, maybe 40 minutes from town on roads that get real narrow toward the end. She was 78, diabetic, had severe arthritis, and a heart condition that required daily monitoring. Sweet lady, but she'd been declining pretty steadily over the past year. I remember driving out there that Tuesday evening around 5 p.m., November weather, already getting that bite to it. Her place was an old log cabin set back in the woods, quarter-mile off the main road down a gravel drive. I'd been there dozens of times, knew exactly what to expect. But her old Ford pickup, the ramp someone had built for her walker, the sound of her oxygen concentrator humming through the windows. But as soon as I got out of my car, something felt wrong. Not horror movie wrong, just tough. The silence was too complete. No TV sounds, no machine noise, not even the usual mountain sounds you'd expect. The air felt thick, like pressure before a storm, and there was this smell I couldn't place. Sweet, but with something underneath it that made my stomach turn slightly. I knocked on her door and waited. After about a minute, I heard footsteps inside. But they were too quick, too steady. Mrs. Henderson shuffled when she walked, especially in the evenings when her joints were stiff. These footsteps had the rhythm of someone much younger. The door opened, and I honestly thought I was looking at Mrs. Henderson's daughter for a second. The woman standing there had the same facial features, but she looked maybe 50 years old instead of nearly 80. Her skin was clear, her posture straight, and she was dressed in jeans and a sweater instead of her usual housecoat. "Hello, dear," she said, and even her voice sounded stronger. "I wasn't expecting you tonight." "Mrs. Henderson?" I kept staring at her, trying to process what I was seeing. "You missed your appointments this week. We couldn't reach you by phone." "Oh, I've been busy with my new health regimen. Come in, come in." I followed her inside, and that's when the wrongness really hit me. All her medical equipment, oxygen concentrator, blood pressure monitor, glucose testing supplies, was pushed into the corner, unplugged and dusty. Her prescription bottles were lined up on the kitchen counter, all of them full. She should have been taking 6 different medications daily. "Mrs. Henderson, have you been taking your medications?" She laughed. Actually laughed, which was something I'd never heard from her before. "I don't need those anymore. I found something much better." The way she said it made my skin crawl. There was something in her tone, like she was sharing a secret she was excited about. "What do you mean?" She walked to her refrigerator and pulled out a mason jar. Inside was what looked like dark honey, but as she set it on the counter, I could see things moving in it. Small things, like tiny pale worms, swimming lazily through the amber liquid. "Natural medicine," she said, unscrewing the lid. "From the forest. It's healing everything." The smell that came from the jar made me step back instinctively. Sweet at first, like wildflower honey, but underneath was something that reminded me of roadkill in summer heat. "Mrs. Henderson, that doesn't look safe. You can't just stop taking prescription medications." "Look at me," she said, spreading her arms. "When's the last time you saw me this healthy?" I had to admit she had a point. She did look incredible. But as she was talking, gesturing with her hands, I noticed something that made my breath catch. Under the skin of her forearms, something was moving. Small bumps that traveled from her wrist toward her elbow, like worms crawling under the surface. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked carefully. "I mean mentally? Any confusion?" Her eyes sharpened, and for a moment they looked completely alien. "I'm thinking clearer than I have in decades." "You look tired, sweetie." "Overworked." This could help you too." She dipped a wooden spoon into the jar, and the creatures became more active, swimming frantically in the thick liquid. "Just a small taste," she said, holding the spoon toward me. "You'll understand." "No, thank you," I said, backing toward the door. "I should get going." But she moved to block my path with speed that was impossible for someone her age. "You can't leave yet. Not until you understand what this means." That's when I noticed the other medical bags by the door. Bags that didn't belong to Mrs. Henderson. A stethoscope I didn't recognize. Car keys on the counter. Whose bags are those? The other nurses who visited this week. They decided to stay and learn about the medicine. From the back of the cabin, I heard voices. Multiple voices, talking quietly but enthusiastically. "Sarah, that you out there?" someone called. I recognized the voice, Jenny Matthews from our office, who'd gone missing 4 days ago. "Jenny's here?" "We're all here," another voice answered. "Come see what we've discovered." 3 women emerged from the back bedroom. Jenny, Patricia from County Health, and Maria from a different agency. They all looked 20 years younger than they should have, glowing with health. But their eyes had that same alien sharpness as Mrs. Henderson's, and I could see things moving under all their skin. "Sarah," Jenny said, walking toward me with movements that were too fluid, too coordinated. "This is incredible. The organisms aren't parasites, they're partners." "Partners," Patricia echoed. "They repair everything wrong with your body, make you stronger, healthier, more capable. In exchange," Maria continued, "they just need a host, and we help them find new hosts." They were surrounding me now, but not aggressively, more like they were genuinely excited to share good news. "Think about it," Mrs. Henderson said. "No more watching people suffer from diseases we can't cure. No more feeling helpless when medications fail. This is the solution." Jenny nodded enthusiastically. "The organisms are selective. They choose hosts who can help them spread effectively. Healthcare workers are perfect." "We can heal your entire client base," Patricia added. "Imagine how grateful they'll be when we cure their diabetes, their heart disease, their cancer." Part of me was listening, really listening. They did look healthier than any group of people I'd ever seen. Mrs. Henderson demonstrated by cutting her palm with a kitchen knife. The wound sealed completely within seconds. "Perfect healing," she said. "Perfect health, extended lifespan, enhanced cognitive function. All we ask is that you help us share it." The rational part of my brain was screaming that this was wrong, that whatever was moving under their skin wasn't natural. But another part was genuinely tempted. I thought about Mrs. Chen, struggling with Alzheimer's. Mr. Rodriguez, dying slowly of pancreatic cancer. All my clients who were suffering despite everything modern medicine could offer. "What's the catch?" I asked. "No catch," Maria said. "Just partnership. Symbiosis. You keep doing your job, but now you can actually heal people instead of just managing their decline." I pretended to consider while slowly reaching for my phone. Managed to send a quick text, just my location and help, before Patricia gently took the phone from my hands. "No need for outside contact yet," she said kindly. "Let's focus on your decision." "What decision?" "Whether you accept the 10 organisms willingly," Mrs. Henderson said, "or if we need to encourage you. Willing hosts integrate more successfully." The sweet smell was getting stronger, making me dizzy. The creatures in the jar were climbing out onto the rim now, moving with purpose. "I need time to think," I said. "We understand," Jenny said. "But we can't let you leave without deciding. The organisms don't like exposure to potential threats." That's when I realized I wasn't leaving this cabin the same way I'd entered it. Either I'd accept infection willingly, or they'd force it. Looking at their enhanced physical condition, I knew I couldn't fight them off. But maybe I could outsmart them. "Okay," I said finally. "I want to try it, but I want to understand how it works first. Can you show me the source?" "Where you found them?" Mrs. Henderson smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from any of them. "Of course, education is important for successful integration." She led me out the back door of the cabin, the others following. We walked about 50 yards into the forest, where there was a depression in the ground I hadn't noticed before. It looked like a sinkhole, maybe 10 feet across, filled with that same honey-like substance. "Natural spring, Mrs. Henderson explained. The organisms have been here for a very long time, waiting for the right hosts. I peered into the depression and felt my stomach lurch. The entire surface was moving. Millions of the pale creatures swimming in thick liquid that went down farther than I could see. How long? I asked. We think centuries, Patricia said. Maybe longer. They're incredibly patient. And intelligent, Maria added. They learn from each host, adapting their approach to be more effective. Jenny dipped a cup into the sinkhole and offered it to me. Just a sip to start. Let them assess your compatibility. The cup was warm in my hands, and I could feel the creatures moving against the sides. Up close, they looked almost like tiny, translucent shrimp, but with too many legs and movements that seemed too coordinated to be natural. What happens if I'm not compatible? I asked. The four women exchanged glances. You will be. Mrs. Henderson said firmly. They've been preparing for you since you arrived. I raised the cup to my lips, pretending to drink while actually just touching the liquid to my mouth. Immediately, I felt the creatures trying to crawl past my teeth, and I had to fight not to gag. Good, Jenny said approvingly. Now swallow. Instead, I suddenly threw the cup as hard as I could into the forest and ran. I heard them shouting behind me, but their voices sounded different now, less human, more like animals calling to each other. I crashed through the woods, branches tearing at my clothes, heading for where I thought my car might be. Behind me, I could hear them pursuing, but they weren't running like normal people. The sounds were wrong, too fast, too coordinated, like pack animals hunting. I found my car and fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so bad I could barely get them in the ignition. As I started the engine, I saw them emerge from the tree line. In the headlights, their movements looked completely inhuman now. Jerky, puppet-like, as if the things under their skin were controlling their muscles directly. I gunned it down the gravel drive, not looking back until I reached the main road. When the state police investigated 3 days later, they found the cabin empty. No sign of Mrs. Henderson or the other women. No medical equipment, no personal belongings, no evidence that anyone had been living there recently. The sinkhole was gone too, just normal forest floor where I swore it had been. But here's what really keeps me up at night. I went back to check on my other clients the next week, and I've started noticing things. Mrs. Chen's Alzheimer's symptoms are improving. Mr. Rodriguez's cancer, markers are dropping. 3 of my clients have suddenly stopped needing their medications. And yesterday, I found a mason jar on my doorstep, full of that dark, sweet-smelling liquid, with things moving inside it. There was a note attached. When you're ready to help them properly. Your friends? I threw the jar away, but I keep thinking about my clients getting better. About how tired I am of watching people suffer when there might be a solution sitting in my garbage can. I know it's wrong. I know those things aren't natural, and whatever they do to you changes you into something that isn't quite human anymore. But Mrs. Rodriguez called yesterday to tell me her husband's tumors have completely disappeared, and I can't stop thinking about that jar. The thing is, I've been having these dreams lately. Dreams about swimming in warm, thick liquid, surrounded by tiny creatures that want to help me. In the dreams, I'm not afraid anymore. In the dreams, I understand that they're not parasites, they're evolution. And every morning when I wake up, the dreams feel a little more reasonable. I found out yesterday that our agency is hiring new staff, young people, recent graduates, full of idealism about helping others, the kind of people who might be very interested in a revolutionary new approach to healthcare. I've been thinking about organizing a training retreat, somewhere quiet, away from town, maybe in an old cabin I know about in Thorn Creek Hollow. After all, if the organisms are as selective as they seem, they'll only take hosts who can really make a difference. And I'm starting to think that maybe making a difference is worth almost anything. The jar is still in my garbage can, but I haven't put the garbage out for pickup yet. I keep telling myself, I'm going to throw it away properly tomorrow, but tomorrow keeps not coming. I was 29 when I took the job that destroyed my life. I'd been freelancing as a wedding planner for 3 years, mostly doing country club receptions and vineyard ceremonies around Virginia. The work was steady but boring until I got a call from this couple, Sarah and Mike, who wanted something different. They were horror movie fanatics planning a Halloween wedding at an abandoned cabin they'd found up in Ravens Ridge. The pay was double my usual rate, and honestly, I was excited for something creative. I should mention, I grew up in eastern Tennessee, so old mountain cabins don't usually spook me. My grandfather had a hunting lodge up near Gatlinburg that was probably twice as isolated as anything in Virginia. I figured I knew what I was dealing with. The cabin sat about 2 miles off, Route 33, down a gravel road that wound through dense hardwood forest. It was perfect for their vision. Weathered log construction with a stone chimney, wraparound porch sagging just enough to look authentically abandoned but still structurally sound. Inside, someone had maintained the basics. No water damage, floors were solid, even had electricity running from a generator hookup. Sarah and Mike were thrilled with the space. They walked around taking pictures while I measured rooms and planned logistics. Standard wedding stuff, just in an unusual venue. That's when I started noticing the cabin's strange design choices. Every room had perfect sightlines across the entire space. Not practical sightlines, theatrical ones, like someone had planned exactly where an audience would look. The windows were positioned so you'd catch peripheral movement outside, just glimpses that would make you turn your head. The acoustics were deliberately strange too. Whispers carried perfectly from certain corners, while normal conversation died completely in other spots. I mentioned these features to Sarah and Mike, thinking they'd love the natural, creepy atmosphere. Mike got excited and suggested I document the whole planning process in a blog. Planning a horror wedding in a real haunted cabin. He said it would be great marketing and fun reading for their guests. That blog killed them both. I know that now. I threw myself into the project, writing detailed posts about every aspect of the planning. I described the atmospheric sounds we'd use, specific creaking patterns, timing for wind effects, even the acoustics of different crying sounds for maximum emotional impact during the ceremony. I wrote about lighting effects, using the cabin's strange shadows to create dramatic moments. I planned everything down to the minute. The first sign something was wrong came after my second post. I was at the cabin checking measurements when I heard the exact sound sequence I'd written about, 3 sharp creaks followed by 2 long groans. Not similar sounds. The identical pattern, timing, and pitch I'd described in detail. I told myself it was coincidence. But then it happened again the next day, at the precise time I'd specified in my blog for the sound effects. By my 4th post, I was documenting cold spots and mysterious drafts as planned atmospheric effects. When I returned to the cabin, those exact temperature changes existed in the locations I'd written about. Not general coolness, ISC, specific zones where the temperature dropped 15 degrees, positioned exactly where I'd planned to fake supernatural phenomena. That's when I understood I wasn't planning decorations. I was writing instructions, and something was following them. I researched the cabin's history and found records going back to 1923. The original owner, Thomas Morrison, had built it as what he called a demonstration space for his theatrical company. Morrison specialized in immersive horror experiences. His final Purdy, live shows where the audience became part of the performance. His final production was called The Wedding Party, performed in October 1947. All 7 performers and 12 audience members disappeared that night. The only survivor was Morrison himself, found 3 days later, catatonic and clutching pages of what investigators described as performance notes written in an unknown hand. Morrison spent the rest of his life in state psychiatric care, insisting that his notes had been edited by the audience and that his performers were still following the script. I found copies of Morrison's original notes in the county archives. The handwriting matched mine perfectly. My 5th blog post wrote itself. I sat down to document flower arrangements and found myself typing a detailed account of 7 people dying during a wedding ceremony in 1947. I described how the bride and groom performed a ritual that opened a door between worlds, allowing something ancient to step through and claim them all. I wrote about how their guests became part of the performance, adding their own deaths to the script until the story was complete. When I finished typing, I realized I'd been writing for 6 hours. It was past midnight, and I had no memory of most of what I'd written. I tried to delete the post, but the words wouldn't disappear. Every attempt to edit the text resulted in more detailed descriptions of the 1,947 deaths. When I tried to shut down my laptop, it kept running, adding new paragraphs about how the Morrison wedding had been practice for something bigger. The next morning, I found emails from Sarah and Mike thanking me for the most authentic research and confirming they wanted to proceed with the full historical recreation. But I'd never sent them that blog post. And when I checked their previous messages, the writing style had changed. The emails now read like they'd been written by different people entirely. That's when I discovered the truth about my clients, Sarah Morrison and Michael Morrison. Siblings who died in 1947 during their joint wedding ceremony, a practice that had been legal but uncommon in Virginia at the time. They'd been possessing living people for 76 years, hiring wedding planners to recreate their final performance. I tried to run, packed my car, drove straight for I-81 South. But every road led back to the cabin. GPS showed me taking different routes, passing different landmarks, but I always ended up in that clearing, looking at that porch where my laptop sat open, adding new content to my blog. The cabin wouldn't let me leave until the story was finished. My final blog posts documented the remaining wedding planners who'd worked at the cabin. Jennifer Walsh, 2003. Marcus Peterson, 2008. Sarah Kim, 2011. Rebecca Torres, 2011. All of them had started with simple wedding planning and ended up writing their own deaths into Morrison's expanding script. I read their posts, watched them discover what I'd discovered, saw them realize they were trapped in a story that required their participation. Each one had tried to escape, and each failure had added new chapters to Morrison's performance. The Morrison siblings needed 7 deaths to complete their original ritual. They'd been collecting wedding planners one by one, adding each death to their script until they had enough performers for the finale. I was number 7. My last blog post was supposed to document my death during the wedding ceremony. Just like the others, Morrison's script demanded I hang myself from the cabin's main beam while the ceremony reached its climax, providing the final sacrifice needed to open their door permanently. But I'd read the other planners' posts, studied their mistakes, and I realized Morrison had made an error in his theatrical design. The cabin was built for audience participation. Every sightline, every acoustic trick, every shadow was designed to make observers part of the performance. Morrison's original script relied on the audience joining the story willingly, adding their own deaths to complete the ritual. But what if the audience refused to participate? Instead of writing my death, I wrote something else. I documented how I discovered Morrison's script, explained exactly how the cabin manipulated wedding planners into becoming performers, revealed the true purpose behind the perfect sightlines and strange acoustics. I uploaded evidence, photos of Morrison's original notes, copies of the other planners' blogs showing their gradual possession, maps showing how every road led back to the cabin for trapped victims. Most importantly, I wrote detailed instructions for any future wedding planner on how to recognize the signs and escape before becoming part of Morrison's script. By making the cabin's methods public, I'd broken the primary rule of audience participation. The audience has to believe they're experiencing something real. Once people knew it was a performance, they couldn't be drawn in as unwilling participants. Morrison's script required willing performers. My blog post had made that impossible. The cabin fought back. Every electronic device within 50 miles experienced simultaneous failure for exactly 7 minutes, the time it took my final blog post to upload completely to every backup server and social media platform I could access. When the blackout ended, I was free to leave. That was 3 weeks ago. The cabin burned down the next morning. Electrical fire, according to the fire department. Nothing salvageable. The insurance investigation found no evidence of the generator system that had been powering the building. But my blog is still active. Still getting hits from wedding planners who've been contacted by clients named Morrison. Each one reports the same thing. Initial excitement about a creative Halloween wedding, followed by strange dreams about abandoned cabins and detailed scripts they don't remember writing. I'm documenting every contact, warning each planner individually, trying to make sure Morrison's script never gets performed again. Because here's what I didn't mention before. The cabin burning down wasn't the end of the story. Morrison's siblings are still looking for their 7 performers. And now they're not limiting themselves to one cabin or one wedding planner at a time. Yesterday, I got a message from a wedding planner in North Carolina. She'd been hired by Sarah and Mike Morrison for a November ceremony at a historic theater. Her first blog post about the planning process was already online. I tried to call her. The number was disconnected. I'm writing this as a warning for anyone in the wedding planning industry who gets contacted by clients named Morrison. Don't take the job. Don't visit their venue. Don't start documenting the planning process. Morrison's script is still being performed, and they need 7 deaths to complete their ritual. They've learned to spread out geographically, hiring multiple planners simultaneously to ensure they get their required performers. If you're reading this and you've been hired by the Morrisons, stop now. Delete their contact information. Don't go to their venue, because once you start writing their story, it becomes your story too, and their script always ends the same way. I was 31 when I got assigned the package that changed everything. Been driving delivery routes for UPS in eastern Kentucky for about 8 years. By then, good, honest work that kept my family fed and gave me health insurance. My wife Sarah was pregnant with our third, and money was tight, but we were managing. I knew these mountain roads better than most, all the forgotten hollows and abandoned homesteads where folks still lived off the grid. It was early November 2019 when the package showed up on my manifest. Heavy thing, maybe 30 pounds, wrapped in brown paper that looked decades old. The address read, Morrison Family Trust, Moonshine Ridge, Kentucky. But my GPS came up blank. No such place existed according to the satellite maps. The label on top made my skin crawl. Family inheritance, do not open, generational transfer required, November only. No return address anywhere. My supervisor Jim just shrugged when I asked about it. Corporate says it's priority delivery. They gave us some hand-drawn directions. He handed me a slip of paper with instructions that looked like they'd been copied from something much older. Turn left at the lightning-struck oak. Follow the creek road 2 miles. Look for the stone mailbox. The kind of directions mountain folk used before roads had proper names. I saved that delivery for last, figuring if I couldn't find the place, I'd bring it back and let corporate deal with the mess. But something about that package bothered me during my whole route. It felt important, weighty beyond just the physical pounds. And there was this smell coming from it. Not bad exactly, but old, ancient. Like opening a coffin that had been sealed for generations. The first part of the directions took me deeper into the mountains than I usually went. These were the real backwood areas where families had lived since before Kentucky was even a state. The houses got fewer and farther between as I climbed higher, until I was driving through what felt like a green tunnel of overhanging branches. My radio cut out first, then my cell phone lost signal completely. Even my GPS started acting up, showing roads that weren't there and missing ones I was actually driving on. I found the lightning-struck oak exactly where the directions said. Half the massive tree was charred black and dead, but the other half still grew green and wild. There was a dirt road beside it that wasn't on any map, barely wide enough for my truck. Branches scraped both sides as I drove, leaving long scratches in the brown paint. The creek road was more suggestion than actual road, just 2 tire tracks with dead grass growing between them. Everything was too quiet out here. No birds, no insects, no wind, just the sound of my engine echoing off the trees in a way that seemed wrong. After 20 minutes of careful driving, I started checking my mirrors more often. Something felt like it was following me, but every time I looked, there was nothing but empty road behind. The stone mailbox appeared around a bend like something out of a fever dream. It was carved from a single piece of mountain granite, worn smooth by weather but still solid. No numbers, no name, just a dark rectangular opening that seemed to swallow light. Behind it, maybe 100 yards up a winding gravel drive, stood a cabin. This wasn't like the other mountain homes I'd seen. It looked old, really old, but in perfect condition. The logs were dark with age, but without a trace of rot. The metal roof was rust-free, and smoke drifted from a fieldstone chimney. What struck me most was how wrong it felt. Like looking at a photograph that had been doctored, where everything seemed normal until you noticed the shadows all fell the wrong direction. I parked at the end of the drive and grabbed the package. It felt heavier now, like it was gaining weight the closer it got to its destination. As I walked toward the cabin, I noticed the windows were old-style glass with bubbles and waves that distorted whatever was inside. But I could see movement in there, shapes passing back and forth like people going about their daily lives. The silence pressed against my eardrums. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind of dead air you get in sealed tombs. My footsteps on the gravel sounded too loud, echoing in ways that didn't make sense. That's when I realized I wasn't alone on that path. Footsteps matched mine, step for step, but slightly off rhythm. When I stopped, they stopped a half second later. When I started again, they followed. But there was nobody behind me. Nobody anywhere. Just my own shadow stretching long across the gravel, and another shadow walking beside it that shouldn't have existed. I never knocked on that door. I was still 10 feet away when it opened, and an elderly man stepped onto the porch like he'd been watching me since I turned off the main road. He was tall and gaunt, with hands that looked ancient but moved, with a steadiness that seemed unnatural. His eyes were the worst part, too pale, too knowing, like they'd seen things no human eyes should ever see. "You're right on time," he said, and his voice had a quality that made my teeth ache. Not unfriendly, but old. Impossibly old. Like it had been talking since before these mountains had names. I held out the package with hands that had started shaking without my permission. "Morrison Family Trust?" He smiled, and his smile was too wide for any human face. "Indeed we are." He signed for the package with those steady hands, but his signature looked wrong, flowing and precise like calligraphy. But the letters seemed to move slightly when I wasn't looking directly at them. As he handed back my electronic pad, I caught a glimpse inside the cabin through the open door. What I saw there made my knees go weak. There were people inside. There were people inside, a whole family sitting around a massive wooden table. But they weren't from the same time, period. Some wore clothes from the 1800s, long dresses and suspenders, and things you'd see in old photographs. Others were dressed like it was the 1952nd. Still others from different decades entirely. All different eras, but they were sitting together like they'd been having the same conversation for decades. "We're the Morrison family," the old man said, like he could see the confusion and fear on my face. "We've been keeping watch over these mountains for a very long time, much longer than most folks would believe." I should have said, "Have a good day," and left. Every instinct screamed at me to get back to my truck and drive away fast. But something about the way he said it, something about the weight of the air around that cabin, made me ask, "What kind of watch?" His too wide smile got wider. "Come inside for a moment. Let me show you what you've been carrying. I think you'll find it educational." The smart part of my brain was screaming warnings, but my feet followed him anyway. The inside of the cabin was bigger than it should have been, with rooms stretching back farther than the building could possibly contain. The family members I'd glimpsed were all there, sitting motionless around that wooden table. Up close, I could see they really were from different time periods, not just their clothes, but their hair, their posture, even the way their eyes reflected the firelight. None of them blinked, not once. "Family business," the old man said, setting my package on the table. "We've been receiving deliveries like this for generations. Offerings from families all across these mountains who understand what we do here." He opened the package with a knife that looked hand-forged from black iron. Inside were bundles of jewelry, old coins, and what looked like family heirlooms, rings and necklaces, and precious things that families had owned for generations. But underneath the valuables was something else that made my vision blur when I tried to focus on it. Documents, maybe, or photographs, but they seemed to show things that couldn't exist. "Payment," he explained, "for keeping certain things contained. It's an arrangement that goes back to when these mountains were first settled." I wanted to ask what kind of things needed containing, but one of the women at the table, she was wearing a dress from maybe the 1922nd, but her eyes looked centuries old, poured me a glass of clear liquid from a mason jar. "Drink," she said, and her voice echoed like it was coming from the bottom of a well. The whiskey burned going down, but not in the normal way. It burned like acid, like liquid fire eating through my chest and spreading into my limbs. For a moment, I felt connected to something vast and hungry that lived deep in these mountains. Something that had been waiting in the dark places between trees since long before humans walked these ridges. That's when the old man made his proposal. "You know these roads," he said. "You have access to the postal system, shipping networks, all the ways things move quietly from place to place. We could use someone like you." He explained how it would work. I'd keep my UPS job as cover, but I'd also coordinate special deliveries for the network. Packages like the one I'd just brought, offerings and payments from families who knew what lurked in the deep woods. In exchange, I'd be protected. My family would be safe. Protected from what? I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want the answer. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. The shadows in the corners of the room began moving independently of the firelight, reaching toward me with finger-like tendrils. Something tall and impossibly thin unfolded itself from the darkness behind the family. Something that might have been human once, long ago, before it changed into something else. It wore the rotted remains of old Cherokee clothing, but its face was wrong in every possible way. Too many teeth. Eyes like black holes that seemed to pull light into them and swallow it. When it spoke, the words formed directly in my mind without passing through my ears. "The compact is old," it said. "Older than your kind's memory. We protect the settlements from what sleeps deeper in the earth. In exchange, we require sustenance." Images flooded my mind. It's other delivery drivers who joined the network, but not the success stories the old man had implied. I saw drivers who'd aged decades and months, whose families had forgotten they ever existed, whose children had been changed. I saw what the network really was, a feeding system. The offerings weren't protection money, they were bait. The entity showed me what it fed on: fear, despair. The slow corruption of human souls who thought they were making smart business decisions. Every delivery I made would bind me tighter to the network, would make me more dependent on its protection, would slowly hollow me out until nothing remained but a shell that served its hunger. But the worst part was the truth about my family. The protection it offered wasn't protection at all, it was a claim. My wife, my children, they would belong to the mountain now. And when they got old enough, when they'd absorbed enough of the mountain's influence, they would take their places at that table with the other Morrison family members who had made the same choice I was being offered. "Choose quickly," the entity whispered in my mind. "The whiskey in your system makes the binding easier, but it won't last long." I could feel it working in my blood, making my thoughts sluggish, making the offer seem reasonable. The old man's smile never wavered as he watched the internal battle playing out on my face. This was just business to him. Another driver recruited, another family claimed, another few decades of feeding secured. That's when I saw her. Sitting at the far end of the table was a woman in a UPS uniform. A modern uniform, like mine. She looked maybe 30, with short brown hair and dead, empty eyes. On her shirt was a name tag that read, Jennifer. As I stared at her, she turned her head toward me with movements that were too slow, too mechanical. Her mouth opened, and she spoke in a voice like rustling leaves. "I had 2 children. I can't remember their names anymore." The fear that hit me then burned through the whiskey's influence like acid. This was my future. This was what joining the network really meant. I would deliver their packages and take their money and slowly forget everything that made me human until I was just another empty shell sitting at their table for eternity. I ran. The entity shrieked behind me, a sound like breaking glass mixed with screaming wind. The cabin shuddered around me as I stumbled toward the door, but the old man didn't try to stop me. He just smiled, his too wide smile, and called after me. "You can't avoid us forever. We know where you live. We know where your family sleeps. You'll be back." I made it to my truck somehow, though I don't remember the trip across the gravel drive. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely get the key in the ignition. As the engine turned over, I looked back at the cabin one last time. Every window was full of faces now. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all staring at me with dead, hungry eyes. Some wore modern clothes, others were dressed from different eras, but they all had the same expression of hollow need. And in the center of them all stood the entity, tall and impossible, raising one skeletal hand in what might have been a wave or a threat. I drove, fast as I dared on those narrow mountain roads, not slowing down until I hit the main highway. My radio crackled back to life, my GPS found its signal again, and my cell phone started buzzing with missed messages from my wife. But even as the normal world reasserted itself around me, I knew it wasn't over. That was 3 years ago. I never delivered another package to Moonshine Ridge, but I didn't have to. They found other ways to remind me of our arrangement. Dead animals on my doorstep, footsteps in my yard at night, my children waking up screaming about the tall man in their bedroom. My wife thinks I'm having a breakdown. She scheduled me for therapy next month, keeps asking why I won't take night shifts anymore, why I insist on driving her to work instead of letting her take the back roads alone. I can't tell her the truth. Who would believe it? Last week, I got a package at my own house, no return address, wrapped in that same old brown paper. Inside was a single photograph of my family, my wife, my 3 kids, and me, taken from inside our living room while we were sleeping. On the back, someone had written in that flowing, ancient handwriting, "November is coming again. We'll be waiting." I've been thinking about moving, somewhere far from these mountains, somewhere the network can't reach. But late at night, when the house creaks and settles around us, I hear that entity's voice whispering in the dark spaces between walls. You can't run from what you've seen. You can't unsign the contract written in your fear. My wife is starting to notice the shadows that follow me home from work. Shadows that don't match the light, shadows that move when I'm not looking. She asked me yesterday why there are always 2 shadows trailing behind me when I walk to the mailbox. I couldn't tell her it's because part of me never left that cabin. Part of me is still sitting at that table, aging and forgetting, while the hungry dark spreads through my family like infection. November is 2 weeks away, and this year, I think they're done being patient. I was 28 when I took the cable technician job, mostly because it paid decent and got me away from people. This was back in 2019, and I'd been covering the rural routes through southwestern Virginia for about 2 years. The mountain roads were quiet, and honestly, I preferred dealing with old timber cabins over apartment complexes any day. The work order that changed everything came through on a gray November morning. Fiber optic installation for an address way up in Whispering Pines Hollow, a place I'd never heard of, and I thought I knew every backwoods settlement in my territory. What made it strange wasn't just the location. Someone had requested our premium fiber package, the kind of speeds that cost more per month than most folks out there made in 2 weeks. According to our coverage maps, that area shouldn't have had any infrastructure at all. I called dispatch to double check, but everything looked legitimate in their system. Customer had paid 6 months up front, cash, deposit, the whole deal. Said his name was Davidson and he needed installation done immediately. The GPS coordinates were clear enough, so I loaded up my van with extra cable and headed into the mountains. The drive started normal, Route 460 west, then onto smaller state roads that climbed higher into timber country. But about an hour in, my GPS started acting confused, constantly recalculating like it couldn't figure out where I was supposed to go. The roads themselves felt wrong too. The asphalt was the right color, but it had this oily texture that made my tires slip just slightly on every turn. Trees pressed closer to the road than they should have, and I realized I hadn't seen any power lines for the last 20 minutes. No telephone poles, no cell towers, nothing. Just endless forest getting darker as the afternoon light faded. When I finally reached the coordinates, I sat in my van staring at what couldn't be right. There was a cabin there, exactly where the work order said it would be. But the building looked like it had been rotting in those woods for 50 years. Gray weathered siding, windows black as holes, roof sagging under the weight of moss and dead branches. But there were electrical lines running to it, fresh copper wire strung between new poles, humming with current. Before I could decide what to do, the front door opened. The man who came out looked normal enough, middle-aged, wearing jeans and a work shirt. But something was off about the way he moved, like he was thinking about each step before taking it. When he waved, his hand stayed up just a little too long. "You're from the cable company," he said when I rolled down my window. Not a question. His voice sounded right, but there was a delay, like he was translating words in his head before speaking them. "Mr. Davidson, I'm here for the fiber installation." "Yes. Please bring your equipment inside." I grabbed my tool bag and followed him up to the cabin. The porch boards groaned under our weight, soft with rot, but somehow they held. Inside was worse than outside. The air was thick and stale, tasting of mold and something metallic I couldn't identify. Furniture filled the room, chairs and tables that looked almost normal but felt wrong, like someone had described human furniture to a craftsman who'd never actually seen any. "I need internet access," Davidson said, pulling out a thick envelope. "For communication with associates. This should cover installation and service." The money felt strange in my hands. The bills looked real, right texture, right weight, but something about them seemed off, though I couldn't say what. I started looking for the best entry point for the fiber line, drilling test holes to see what I was working with. That's when I found the existing wiring. Through the gaps in the walls, I could see cables made from metals that weren't in any manual I'd studied. They had this weird iridescent quality and were warm to the touch, even though no current should have been running through them. My equipment started malfunctioning the moment I connected to their electrical system. Signal readings that violated everything I knew about fiber optics. Power levels that should have fried my gear, but somehow the signals stayed clean. It was like physics worked differently inside this cabin. "Interesting technology," Davidson said, watching me work. He kept asking detailed questions about data transmission and network protocols, but his questions were too advanced, touching on concepts that weren't even in commercial use yet. As I worked deeper into the installation, I started seeing things that couldn't be there. Doorways that led to rooms bigger than the cabin's exterior. Hallways stretching back further than the building could contain. Shadows moving independently of their sources. My hands were shaking as I ran the main cable, but I kept working. Davidson had already paid me, and something told me stopping would be a very bad idea. "I should explain," he said, while I connected the primary junction. "I'm not from around here. This connection helps me stay in touch with my real home." When I ran my signal tests, my equipment picked up network traffic coming from coordinates that placed the source somewhere in deep space. Not satellites, not ground stations, somewhere among the stars. That's when I noticed the tire tracks outside, fresh ruts from other service vehicles in the mud. But when I called dispatch, they had no record of previous appointments. According to their system, I was the first technician ever sent to this address. Davidson saw my confusion and gestured to photographs on the walls. The same cabin I was standing in, but in landscapes that looked completely alien. Desert terrain under purple skies, forests of crystalline trees, coastlines with black sand and too many moons. "This place exists in several locations simultaneously," he said, like he was explaining something obvious. "It's quite convenient for research purposes." My blood went cold. "Research? We study developing civilizations. Your communication networks provide excellent data about human social patterns and technological progress." I realized what I was doing, what I'd been hired to do. I was connecting Earth's internet to something that was watching us, studying us, cataloging our every digital communication. "The work pays well," Davidson continued, "and we need technical support at other observation stations across these mountains. Would you be interested in additional contracts?" I wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at me to drop my tools and sprint for my van. But Davidson was standing between me and the door, and something in his too-still posture suggested that running would end badly. "What kind of additional work?" I heard myself ask. He showed me a list of addresses throughout Appalachia. Dozens of them. Each one, he explained, was another observation post, another cabin that existed partially in our world and partially elsewhere. "Your species has a natural aptitude for working with technologies that don't follow standard physical laws," he said. "It makes you excellent technicians for our equipment." Over the following weeks, I found myself driving to impossible locations, installing communication arrays that connected Earth to networks spanning galaxies. Each job paid more than I'd ever made, but the work was changing me. My hands had developed a tremor that wouldn't go away. I'd lost 15 pounds because food tasted wrong. Sleep brought dreams of endless dark spaces filled with watching eyes. The worst part was realizing I couldn't stop. They'd shown me too much, involved me too deeply in their surveillance network. I'd become a critical part of their operation, the human interface that kept their observation posts connected to our world. My girlfriend noticed the detour changes. She asked about the government contracts I was supposedly working on, wondered why I came home exhausted and jumpy after what should have been simple installations. I told her it was classified work, which wasn't entirely a lie. 6 months after that first installation, I got another work order. Different address, same hollow. When I arrived, I found the original cabin empty, abandoned again. No sign anyone had ever lived there. But the fiber optic line I'd installed was still active, still carrying impossible amounts of data to coordinates that placed them somewhere in the void between stars. I tried to find Davidson, tried to contact the other observation posts, but every address led to empty cabins, rotting buildings that looked like they'd been abandoned for decades. Only the communications equipment remained, humming quietly in the dark, continuing its surveillance of humanity. That's when I understood the real horror of what they'd done. They didn't need permanent installations. They could set up observation posts anywhere, use local technicians to build their networks, then fade back into whatever dimension they came from, leaving their equipment behind to keep watching. I quit the cable company that winter, moved to Florida, as far from those mountains as I could get. But sometimes, I still wake up thinking about those impossible cables, those networks spanning impossible distances, wondering how many other technicians they've recruited, how many observation posts are hidden in the rural corners of America, and wondering what they're planning to do with all that data they've been collecting about us. I never went back to those mountains, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can still hear the humming of alien machinery somewhere in the distance, continuing its patient surveillance of our world.